Julian believed nothing could touch him as he stood confidently in the courtroom, wearing a smug smile and acting as if he had just won the biggest victory of his life. He had taken everything from his wife, Elena, her house, her savings, and her sense of self, and openly boasted to others that she was fragile and came from an unimportant family. What Julian failed to understand was that quiet does not always mean surrender. Sometimes it signals patience and careful planning. He had no idea that Elena's distant father was far more than a harmless retired man. And by the time Julian sensed the danger, events were already set in motion beyond his control. On October 14th, 2023, an upscale Midtown Manhattan restaurant, Julian raised an expensive glass of champagne, celebrating what he believed was freedom and success. Seated with him were Marcus, his sharp-tongued attorney who followed money above principles, and Sophia, a young and driven woman Julian had been seeing for months, whose ambition mirrored his own. Marcus praised the settlement, laughing about how Elena was left with an old car and lingering debts, while Julian proudly claimed he had simply taught her how the real world worked. Sophia casually asked about luxury properties, and Julian loudly listed his new assets, clearly wanting others to hear. At 42, as the head of a powerful logistics company, Julian felt unstoppable, convinced he had outplayed everyone, unaware that his confidence was built on a mistake that would soon unravel everything he thought he owned. Julian casually told him he had moved the money through an overseas holding company, though he mocked that it barely mattered since Elena had sat quietly during questioning, staring at her hands and saying almost nothing. When Sophia asked about Elena's family and mentioned her father, Julian laughed it off, calling the man a harmless recluse who lived alone, kept to himself, and had no influence or presence in Elena's life. He dismissed him as irrelevant and powerless, convinced there was nothing to fear. Moments later, Julian received a message from Elena saying she was finishing packing and asking for privacy, which he answered with sharp, threatening reply meant to remind her who now controlled the house. Brushing it off as a minor inconvenience, he ordered another expensive drink and boasted about company money being out her reach, feeling invincible as the night wore on. Though he claimed full credit for his success, the truth was that his business had begun with funds Elena inherited years earlier, a detail he had carefully erased from official records. As the rain poured down later that evening, Julian arrived at the estate, proud and defiant, only to see Elena outside beside her worn car, struggling with a box of books in the storm. He mocked her openly, blaring the horn and shouting about the time, while she knelt in the rain trying to gather her belongings. Sophia added to humiliation with a careless remark, nudging a book into a puddle, but when Elena looked up, there was no fear in her eyes, only a quiet determination that unsettled Julian for the first time. Calmly, despite shaking hands and soaked clothes, Elena wished Sophia well in the house, her steady voice hinting that this moment was far from the end. Julian brushed off Elena's warning with open hostility, stepping forward and knocking her remaining books aside as he ordered her to leave, making it clear he felt untouchable in his own victory. Elena stood still, choosing not to rescue the scattered books, and calmly pointed out that he had taken everything from her, the money, the house, even the dog he never cared for, yet still found ways to be cruel. Julian responded with cold pride, insisting she had always been insignificant without him and claiming full credit for the life they once shared, while Elena quietly reminded him they had built it together. He dismissed her words, declaring he had freed himself, and she finally turned away, closing the trunk on the few belongings she managed to save and driving off into the rain as Julian mocked her departure. Inside the house, his triumph quickly felt hollow. Though nothing valuable was missing, the warmth and comfort were gone, leaving the rooms cold and lifeless despite their luxury. Julian downplayed Elena's father, Sophia, calling him harmless and irrelevant, unaware that far north in a small mountain cabin, an elderly man sat by the fire when the phone rang. Arthur Vance answered to hear his daughter's shaken voice, her strength finally breaking as she told him she had lost everything and didn't know where to turn, and he listened in silence, his grip tightening as years of quiet distance vanished in an instant. Arthur sat motionless, staring into the fire as the warmth faded from his eyes and was replaced by a sharp, focused calm, the kind that comes from long experience rather than anger. When Elena finally finished speaking through her tears, he answered gently, reassuring her that she was safe, that she had enough money to rest for a few nights, and that she should come stay with him the next day where a room was already waiting. She blamed herself for ignoring his warning years earlier, and Arthur quietly reminded her that confidence often makes people reckless, especially when they believe they've already won. After asking a few careful questions, his tone shifted, steady and deliberate, as he told her he would handle things and ended the call. Instead of sleeping, Arthur opened a hidden safe filled not with valuables, but with old records, contacts, and tools from a past life few people knew about, reminding himself of skills he once used to untangle secrets at the highest levels of business. 2 weeks later, Julian stood confidently in his office as his company celebrated soaring profits and a possible international merger, unaware that careful eyes were reviewing his records. When visiting auditors raised concerns about unusual transactions overseas, Julian's confidence faltered for the first time, a quiet warning that the success he believed untouchable might not be as solid as it seemed. Julian instantly recognized Panama as a place where he had quietly parked money during his marriage, confident it was buried beneath layers no one could trace. So he calmly brushed it off as a minor error and promised his finance team would resolve it quickly. That confidence collapsed when he learned the accounts no longer existed and the funds had been moved out entirely, leaving nothing behind and placing the merger on hold until answers appeared. Panic set in as his calls went unanswered, signaling that something far beyond a simple mistake was unfolding. Far north, Elena sat peacefully outside her father's cabin, wrapped in warmth she hadn't felt in months, watching Arthur work with calm focus and quiet strength, offering her rest without explanations. When she finally asked what he had been doing all this time, Arthur gently explained that true change doesn't come from force, but from removing the unseen supports that keep something standing. He told her Julian wasn't being attacked, only slowly exposed, piece by piece, until his own actions caused everything to collapse. Then Arthur placed a small USB drive in her hand, a simple object that carried answers Elena hadn't yet realized were already in motion. Arthur calmly explained that the small drive held access to an old banking system he had helped design decades earlier, one that was never fully secured, allowing him to quietly redirect the money Julian thought was untouchable. He clarified that he hadn't taken anything illegally, but had returned what rightfully belonged to Elena and placed it where Julian could never reclaim it without exposing his own wrongdoing, leaving him trapped by his own greed. Elena looked at her father with a mix of shock and awe as she realized how carefully everything had been planned, not out of anger, but out of protection. Back in the city, Julian unraveled fast, lashing out at employees and his lawyer, as one problem after another surfaced, each more damaging than the last, until fear replaced his usual confidence. When even his closest allies began distancing themselves and whispers followed him through a glamorous charity event, Julian finally sensed the ground shifting beneath his feet, realizing that someone unseen was dismantling his world piece by piece, and there was no obvious way to stop it. Silas leaned in and quietly revealed that a written record of Julian's private dinner conversation had been circulated, capturing every boast he made about hidden money and manipulation, and it had already reached the executives who mattered most. Julian felt the room spin as Silas made it clear this was a legal debate, but a reputation collapse, explaining that once trust was gone, so were opportunities, alliances, and protection. Left standing alone as the Gallipas faded into noise, Julian rushed out in a panic, dragging Sophia with him and spiraling into fear during the drive as he realized someone was dismantling his life with precision. Desperate for answers, he contacted an investigator he once trusted, only to be warned that Elena's father was no ordinary man, but a legendary figure known for quietly ending powerful careers without ever raising his voice. When the call ended, dread settled in completely, and by the time Julian reached his estate and saw a single chair waiting in the darkness with a clean, familiar book resting on it, he understood this was no accident but a message, calm, deliberate, and impossible to ignore, signaling that the reckoning had truly begun. Julian read the passage about being offered the world's power in exchange for loyalty, and beneath it a handwritten note calmly reminded him that his devotion to wealth had finally come with a cost he could no longer avoid. Before he could process it, bright lights flooded the yard and firm voices announced his arrest. Cutting through the night as flashing colors reflected off the grand home he believed was his forever. Confused and furious, Julian shouted his protests, but officers calmly explained they had clear authorization tied to financial misconduct and misuse of family assets, and the cold restraint around his wrists made it real. As he was led away, He noticed an old pickup parked nearby, and inside it, Elena's father watched quietly, offering no triumph, just a single nod before driving off, leaving Julian to face the consequences alone. Days later, wearing unfamiliar prison clothes and posting an enormous bail by draining his last untouched funds, Julian stepped into a storm of cameras and accusations, realizing public sympathy was gone. He returned to what he thought was a safe haven, only to find his access revoked and the building staff no longer bending to his status, forcing him to confront a truth he had spent years avoiding. His power was built on borrowed ground, and now it was collapsing beneath him. Julian demanded that Henry open the elevator, but the concierge calmly explained that the apartment lease belonged to the company, and the board had met earlier that day to remove Julian as CEO, cancel the lease, and change the locks without delay. Stunned and shouting that the company was his creation, Julian listened as Henry added that everything inside the penthouse had been seized to cover outstanding obligations, and that Sophia had already collected her belongings and left behind a note. With shaking hands, Julian read her brief message explaining she wanted no connection to scandal, was leaving town, and was done for good, a final blow that left him standing alone in the marble lobby. In less than a month, his marriage, career, reputation, and inner circle had all vanished, and with his cards rejected and calls unanswered, he ended up in a rundown motel using the last of his cash. Sitting on the worn bed, he phoned Marcus in desperation, only to learn his lawyer was cooperating with authorities and Arthur Vance, revealing that Elena's father was a highly skilled financial investigator who had uncovered every hidden deal and document. When the call abruptly ended, Julian sat in silence, anger replacing fear, convincing himself that despite everything collapsing around him, he still believed he had one final move left to make. Julian suddenly remembered a safety deposit box in Jersey City, a place he believed held the last thing that could save him. Physical drives and sensitive records he thought would give him control again if everything else collapsed. Grabbing his coat, he rushed out, convinced that if his life was falling apart, he could still force the world to listen. At the bank, disguised under a cap and sunglasses, he followed security to box 404 with his heart racing, sure this was his final advantage. Inside the private room, he opened the metal box, only to find it completely empty except for a single fresh tomato and a thick business card bearing Arthur Vance's name. A handwritten note calmly explained that the harmful pieces had already been removed and suggested Julian learn to build something real instead of chasing selfish ambition. Shaken and confused, Julian called the number on the card, and Arthur answered without emotion, revealing that everything had been done legally through a clause Julian himself had overlooked in a prenuptial amendment. With Julian now formally charged, authority over those assets had quietly transferred away from him, leaving him with nothing but the realization that even his last plan had been dismantled long before he arrived. Arthur calmly explained that the box had been emptied legally an hour earlier, and Julian collapsed to the floor, stunned by how completely he had been outplayed. Arthur told him that everything he did was to protect his daughter, reminding Julian that kindness and silence are often mistaken for weakness, and that misunderstanding had cost him everything. Desperate and broken, Julian begged to know what Arthur wanted next, insisting he had already lost his money, his business, and his last advantage. Arthur replied that all he wanted was the truth and a sincere apology, something Julian angrily refused, still clinging to his pride even as it ruined him. Arthur ended the call by revealing the evidence was already in federal hands, sealing Julian's fate. Months later, on the night before sentencing, Julian sat alone in a small Bronx apartment, worlds away from the luxury he once ruled, surrounded by noise from old pipes and the silence of people who no longer cared. His reflection showed a man aged far beyond his years, worn down by stress, loss, and isolation, his former life reduced to memories and regret. His phone stayed quiet, his connections gone, and even his confidence fell hollow as he whispered promises to himself that no longer brought comfort. The image of the tomato stayed with him, a quiet reminder that there was nowhere left to hide. The next morning arrived under gray skies, matching the end of the powerful image Julian Thorne once worked so hard to build. As Julian stepped out of the taxi, unable to afford the luxury cars he once took for granted, the press rushed in from every direction, cameras flashing and voices shouting over one another. The mood was sharp and unforgiving, nothing like before, when questions were about profits and success, because now the crowd was focused on loss anger and accountability. Reporters demanded answers about workers who lost their savings and his future behind bars. While urging him to look up for photos he refused to give, Julian kept his head down, his hands shaking as he tried to block the lights, while his court-appointed lawyer, Mr. Gorski, guided him forward and warned him to stay silent and appear regretful. Julian felt no guilt, only a deep sense of betrayal, convinced he'd been trapped by a calculated plan led by a bitter old man. Inside the courtroom, the air felt heavy and tense, packed with people watching his downfall in silence. As he took his seat, Julian recognized familiar faces in the crowd. Not allies, but people whose lives had been damaged by his choices, including former employees and business owners he had crushed to get ahead. In the back, he saw Elena and Arthur sitting calmly, composed and steady. With Elena looking stronger and more confident than he ever remembered, her eyes fixed firmly on him. Arthur sat beside her, quiet and still, observing without emotion, as if the outcome was already decided. Julian turned forward quickly as the judge entered, her presence commanding the room, and as she began the sentencing. It became clear this moment marked the final chapter of the life Julian once ruled. The court confirmed that the defendant was guilty on 24 serious charges involving financial deception and illegal money handling, and the prosecutor, Ms. Demo, stood confidently before the judge to speak. She made it clear that Julian Thorne did far more than misuse funds. She explained how his actions ruined livelihoods, damaged families, and shattered trust, showing a deep lack of responsibility and remorse while still portraying himself as the wrong party. She detailed how he destroyed his former wife's financial standing, tried to strip her father of everything, and dismantle a company that supported thousands of workers, then firmly asked the court to impose the harshest sentence allowed. Defense attorney Mr. Gorski followed with a softer tone, reminding the court that this was Julian's first conviction and that he had built his business from the ground up, arguing that intense pressure led to poor choices and requesting mercy. The judge then turned to Julian and invited him to speak, and as he rose, visibly shaken, he tried to regain his confidence and present himself as a misunderstood businessman who took risks to support his family. He claimed ambition clouded his judgment, denied being a criminal, and insisted he was unfairly targeted because of his success, which stirred quiet reactions throughout the room. The judge listened patiently before removing her glasses and addressing him with calm firmness, stating that after decades on the bench and witnessing countless cases, she rarely encountered someone so empty of accountability, making it clear that his actions were driven by self-interest, not love or responsibility. The judge spoke firmly, saying Julian's actions were driven by pride and self-interest, not ambition, and that he tried to excuse taking $12 million from a family trust by blaming others and hiding behind business talk, including falsified documents and deliberate deception. She made it clear he was not a respected entrepreneur, but someone who knowingly harmed people for personal gain, then announced a sentence of 15 years in federal prison, with at least 12 years to be served before any chance of release, which sent a shock to the courtroom. She also ordered that every dollar taken be paid back, stating that since his assets were already seized, any money earned in the future would be used to settle the debt, and with one final strike of the gavel, she ordered him taken into custody immediately. Officers moved in without ceremony, securing his hands as the reality finally sank in that his former life was gone for good and there would be no return to comfort or control. In desperation, Julian called out to Elena, insisting she defend him and claim he had shaped her life, but she calmly stepped forward and told him, without anger or bitterness, that he was never a partner to her, only a hard lesson she had finally learned from. She then turned to her father, ready to leave, while Arthur quietly approached, met Julian's gaze, and offered a small, knowing smile that made it clear the outcome had been decided long before this moment. Arthur spoke calmly, reminding Julian that while he had boasted about winning the game, he failed to notice the most important piece was still in play, tapping his head and telling him to get used to the quiet that followed his choices. The officers quickly pushed Julian forward, cutting off his protests as the heavy door closed behind him, sealing his new reality. Life at the federal facility was orderly but unforgiving, and by November he found himself outdoors in the cold, sweeping concrete for a few cents an hour, a sharp contrast to the power he once held. No one there cared about his past success or tailored suits. To everyone around him, he was simply another number, blending into routine and silence. One day, a guard handed him a letter, and for a brief moment hope flared, only to fade when he opened it and found a newspaper article showing Elena smiling proudly at the opening of a small-town bookstore, a project built from recovered funds and honest effort. The article spoke of creating something meaningful, while Arthur modestly credited himself only with tending the garden. And the image of their peaceful success struck Julian harder than any sentence ever could. He folded the paper, looked around at the gray walls and open sky, and slowly returned to his task, understanding too late how easily everything he built had fallen apart. Far away, snow drifted gently outside a quiet cabin where warmth, laughter, and a simple meal filled the evening, and Arthur sat reading comfortably as Elena set down warm drinks, their calm life standing in sharp contrast to the noise Julian had left behind. Sitting by the fire, Elena mentioned to her father that she had heard from Marcus's wife, who shared that life had become difficult for him after losing his career, and asked if they knew of any work. Without lifting his eyes from his book, Arthur calmly joked that he might know of a dairy farm nearby that could use help, honest labor that builds character, which made Elena laugh in a way that felt light and free for the first time in years. Arthur gently reminded her that walking away from harm and choosing peace took real strength, even more than anything he had done, and she smiled, knowing she hadn't been alone. As snow quietly covered the world outside, Arthur explained that true power isn't loud or forceful, but steady and unseen, something that holds everything in place without needing to prove itself. The fire crackled, warm drinks were shared, and their home felt calm and safe, a sharp contrast to the chaos left behind. Far away, Julian sat alone with nothing but time to reflect, realizing too late that confidence built on pride collapses quickly, while quiet strength endures. In the end, the story wasn't about revenge, but about choosing dignity, patience, and a life built on something real, where peace finally returned and the noise faded away.